Okay, I'm going to go over this sheet that I gave you guys in class today, and this is really kind of like a study guide for the types of questions that you may see on the test tomorrow. So on the first page we've got this identifying variables worksheet, and so take a look at this. The directions say for the following experiments, the directions say for the following experiments, identify the three variables for each experiment. The independent variable, so 1, the independent variable, 2, the dependent variable, and 3, the control variable. Well, control variable is an idea that we have not talked about in class, so it's not something that I'm going to require you to know. But I will just say this about the control variable. The control variable is a variable that could change an experiment, but it does not. So, and maybe as we go through these, I'll point out what the control variables are, so you can maybe kind of get an idea of what that is for the future. But it's not an idea that I'm requiring you to know right now in class. But the independent and dependent variable are things that you should know, and they're things from your catechism that you should know. And knowing them from your catechism allows you to do this, because it's ingrained in your mind now, hopefully. So again, the independent variable is a variable that can be changed, that is changed or manipulated by the scientist in an experiment, and the scientist usually knows the value of the independent variable before the experiment is performed. And the dependent variable is the variable that may or may not change in an experiment because of the manipulation of the independent variable by the scientist. And the scientist usually does not know the dependent variable before the experiment is run. Okay, so essentially what I just did is I basically just did at least a paraphrase. If it wasn't word for word, it was pretty close. A paraphrase of what an independent and dependent variable are. Well, the first thing you have to do when you look at these experiments is you have to identify the variables in general. Okay, so we'll look at number 1. Number 1 says different rose bushes are grown in a greenhouse for 2 months. The number of flowers on each bush is counted at the end of the experiment. Okay, so normally what I would have you do is just identify 2 variables in this experiment. There is a third one, and that's the control variable that I haven't emphasized in class very much. And I'll talk about what that is in a second, but again, it's not something you are responsible for. But you are responsible for the independent and dependent variables and being able to identify those. So if we look at this experiment, again, that the scientist is performing, it says different rose bushes are grown in a greenhouse for 2 months. The number of flowers on each bush is counted at the end of the experiment. So we have to find the variables. Well, from our catechism, what a variable is it is a factor that... In the catechism, the variable is a factor that can have more than one value and can change during an experiment. So if we look at this experiment, there are a couple things that can have more than one value and can change in the experiment. One of those things is we have different rose bushes. So we have different kinds of rose bushes. And the other one is the number of flowers. So these are our 2 variables here. So now, from the catechism, we know the independent variable is the variable that the scientist changes or manipulates in the experiment, and the scientist knows the independent variable before the experiment is run. The dependent variable is the variable that may or may not change based on what the scientist or how the scientist manipulates the independent variable, and the scientist usually does not know the value of the dependent variable prior to running the experiment. So we have 2 variables, different rose bushes and number of flowers on each bush. Well, prior to growing the rose bushes, you're not going to know how many flowers each one produces, but you do know the different types of rose bushes that you're growing. So the variable that is known prior to running the experiment and the variable that is manipulated by the scientist are the different rose bushes. The different rose bushes. Okay, now the dependent variable is our other variable that we didn't know before we ran the experiment, but it may or may not change based on what we did to the independent variable. In this case, we changed the type of flower, and so in this case, we could say the dependent variable, which may or may not be different, are the number of flowers on each bush. The number of flowers. Now, just to point it out here, but you're not responsible for it, the control variable in this case, I would say, is time. So each of these rose bushes is grown for the same amount of time, and that is 2 months. A control variable, again, is a variable that could change in an experiment but does not. It is kept under control. It is kept at a set value for all the experimental groups so that it doesn't mess up the experiment. Okay, now number 2 says you water 3 sunflower plants with salt water. Each plant receives a different concentration of salt solutions. A 4th plant receives pure water. After a 2-week period, the height is measured. Okay, well, so if we look at this, we've got to take a look at what we're looking at. We have 3 sunflower plants, so maybe I'll underline a few things here. 3 sunflower plants with salt water. Each plant receives a different concentration of salt water. A 4th plant receives pure water, and then we have a 2-week period, and then we measure the height. Okay, well, there's a lot of stuff going on here, I guess, in this, but really we should only be looking at the things that are changing in the experiment, because those will be our independent and dependent variables, and there should only be 2, especially at our level. So the 2 things that I can identify as changing are the concentration of salt solutions, because it says a different concentration of salt solutions, and then the heights could be different of the different plants. So scientists are running this experiment. The other things are not changing. The 3 sunflower plants and the 2-week period, those are things that don't change, and so ultimately those are probably some control variables, the same species of plant and the same amount of time. Okay, so we have the different concentration of salt and the height of the plants. Well, these are our 2 variables. The independent variable is a variable that is changed or manipulated by the scientist in the experiment, and the scientist knows the value of the independent variable before running the experiment. The dependent variable is the variable that may or may not change because of the manipulation of the independent variable by the scientist in the experiment, and the scientist usually doesn't know the value of the dependent variable in the experiment after the experiment is run. Well, in this case, what the scientist knows prior to running the experiment and what the scientists are manipulating is that concentration of salts, a concentration of salt solutions. In fact, one of them even has pure water, and this group of plants, or this plant right here, that is our control group, which is a concept you should understand. So but we say the concentration of salt water, I'll say H2O for water. And so the dependent variable then would be the other thing that may or may not change because of what the scientists are doing, and that is the height of the plant. So plant height would be our dependent variable. Okay, now for number 3. Number 3, we have 3 redwood trees that are kept at different humidity levels inside a greenhouse for 12 weeks. 1 tree is left outside in normal conditions. Height of the tree is measured once a week. Okay, so again, we've got some control variables and some independent and dependent variables here. So we've got our redwood trees. They're kept at, and then that word different right there is a key word, different humidity levels inside a greenhouse for 12 weeks, so some time there. 1 tree is left outside in normal conditions, and then the height of the tree is measured once a week. Okay, well, once again, in this experiment, we're looking at the thing that the scientists are manipulating or changing and that they know before they run the experiment, and we're looking at the things that the scientists that may or may not change because of what the scientists are doing or are manipulating, and that they don't know until they run the experiment. And so I think if you look at the redwood part and the 12 weeks, those are the control variables, those things that could change, but in this experiment they don't. The different is a key word there. So we see different humidity levels. That's one of our variables that is changing. And then we have the height of the tree, like in number 2 we had height again. So I think that we can see that the scientists are manipulating the humidity levels. So the humidity levels would be our independent variable. It's what they know before they run the experiment. Humidity levels. And again, what they're looking at in the dependent variable is it may or may not change based on different humidity levels, and that is the height of the trees. But they don't know how tall the trees are going to get until they run the experiment. So that's got to be the dependent variable. Again, control variables would be things like the 12 weeks time and the species of tree. Okay, the last example from your little practice study guide thing is listed right here. We have pea plant clones are giving different amounts of water, or given different amounts of water for a 3-week period. Pea plant for a 3-week period. Pea plant receives 400 milliliters a day. The second pea plant, we've got some bad grammar in this question here. The second pea plant receives 200 milliliters a day. The third pea plant receives 100 milliliters a day. The fourth pea plant does not receive any extra water. The plant only receives natural ways of receiving water. Okay, the height of a pea plant is recorded daily. So again, we've got different amounts of water is one variable there, and that word different again sticks out. We've got pea plants or pea plant clones, so they're identical plants to each other, and we've got 3-week periods, so our time is the same, the type of plant's the same. The amount of water is different, and again, we're measuring the height. So what the scientists know ahead of time and what they manipulate in the experiment is the independent variable, and again, in this case, this is the amount of water. And the dependent variable, again, in this case, what they may or may not change because of the amount of water they're giving to plants, but they don't know until they run the experiment, which is a paraphrase of our dependent variable catechism answer, is the height of the plant. Control variables, again, could be things like the type of plant, the pea plants, or the amount of time, the 3-week amount of time. Okay, that's that first page. Maybe I'll do the back page in a little bit, maybe not.